Okay, picture this. Memphis, 2024. Reports say it's got the highest violent crime rate in the whole country. You've even got a friend of the president, a railroad exec, saying he needs an armored vehicle with bulletproof glass just to go one block. But then, and this is the kicker, just days before a massive federal intervention is announced, Memphis's own police department comes out saying crime is actually at a 25-year low in 2025. I mean, what is going on there?
Welcome to Nation Scope Podcast. I'm Jordan. And with me, as always, is Jamie. Join us as we dive into the latest headlines, breaking stories, and critical events shaping America and the world. Politics, culture, economy, tech industry. We try to analyze the news that matters most. And today, we're taking a really deep dive into a pile of documents about a pretty controversial executive action. It's about the federal government's decision back on September 15th, 2025, to send federal law enforcement and ask for the Tennessee National Guard in Memphis, all under this banner of restoring law and order.
And I'm here to help us sort of untangle the legal threads, the politics, the history. It's all woven together in this really complex issue. It's quite a case study in power, legal maneuvering, and just competing stories, really.
Yeah, we're going to explore the reasons given for this, look at the very different viewpoints, and think about the big implications for, how government works and for civil liberties. And definitely stick around, because later we'll get into the, surprising political reasons, perhaps, for choosing Memphis, some clever legal footwork, and the really deep historical vibes this whole thing kicks up in the community. It's a story that really makes you think, what does law and order actually mean, and who decides? Okay, so to really get this, we need to start with the document that kicked it all off. That's the presidential memorandum President Trump signed on September 15th, 2025. It set up something called the Memphis Safe Task Force. What was its main job? How wide was its scope?
Oh, its mandate was incredibly broad, Jordan. The goal was suppressing crime. And the memo spells it out. Hyper-vigilant policing, aggressive prosecution, complex investigations, financial enforcement, and large-scale arrests. It's basically about projecting this overwhelming federal force to hit crime from, every angle.
I'm really struck by the specific way they brought in the National Guard. The memo tells the Secretary of War to request the Tennessee National Guard under Title 32 of the U.S. Code. Why is that specific legal point so important here?
It's absolutely critical. It hinges on the National Guard's sort of unique dual-hatted status. See, under Title 32, the Guard technically stays under state command, in this case, the governor of Tennessee. And that specific legal route lets the administration legally sidestep the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. That's the law that generally stops federal military forces from being used for domestic law enforcement. So it's a very deliberate move.
Right, a workaround. And the president called it a big force. So who exactly was involved in this federal team sent to Memphis?
Well, besides the Guard, it's a pretty long list. FBI, ATF, DEA, U.S. Marshals, and significantly, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. A really comprehensive federal lineup.
Yeah, putting ICE and HSI in there definitely jumps out. That suggests it's not just about local crime fighting, does it? Seems much broader.
It absolutely does. Their involvement allows for, let's call it a conflation of local crime control with national immigration enforcement. Think about it. Someone stopped by this task force for a local issue could suddenly be facing an immigration check. It could potentially turn this whole local policing thing into a kind of feeder system for federal deportation operations, which, ties right into the administration's stated goal of the largest deportation operation in our nation's history. It definitely blurs those lines.
And the administration kept calling it a replica of an operation in D.C. But despite saying that, Memphis Mayor Paul Young pointed out there was a real lack of specifics when it was announced. He was asking basic questions like, when are they coming, how many, how long, what uniforms, where will they even be?
Yeah, that vagueness is, it's telling. It makes you think the operation might have been conceived more as a big statement, a show of federal power, a political move, rather than some meticulously planned, boots-on-the-ground law enforcement strategy.
Yep.
It feels like the details were maybe left to be sorted out after the big announcement.
Which brings us right to the core issue, doesn't it? These completely conflicting stories about crime in Memphis. The whole federal push was justified by saying Memphis was deep in an acute public safety crisis, that crime was rampant, savage, just overwhelming the local government. What was the White House story exactly?
The White House narrative, and they leaned heavily on 2024 data for this, painted a really grim picture. They said Memphis had the highest violent crime rate in the U.S. back in 2024. Total crime rate 344% above the national average. Violent crime going up, bucking the national trend. They even threw in these dramatic international comparisons. Murder rate 4 times Mexico City's, an incredible 27 times Havana's. Really stark stuff.
Right, and you can't ignore that powerful story the president told about his railroad executive friend needing that armored car just to go a single block. That really paints a picture of chaos, but then you hear something totally different from the folks on the ground.
Exactly. Now, contrast that sharply with what the Memphis Police Department was saying about 2025. Literally days before the president's big announcement, the MPD reported historic crime reductions across every major category for the current year. And this wasn't just them saying it. The Memphis Shelby Crime Commission backed it up.
So wait, for the first 8 months of 2025, overall crime, 25-year low. Robbery, burglary, larceny, also 25-year lows. Murder at a 6-year low. Aggravated assault at a 5-year low. I mean, it's almost dizzying, these two completely different takes on the city's safety. How do you square that circle?
Well, it's maybe less about squaring it and more about seeing the deliberate narrative framing at play. The administration very strategically highlighted the lagging data from 2024, which, yes, was a tough year for crime in Memphis, to build this crisis narrative that justified stepping in. But in doing so, they consciously sidestepped the most current, positive trend data from 2025 that was coming directly from local police. The president even claimed, though offered no proof, that any recent drop was actually because of some secret, unannounced federal presence already there. So yeah, it wasn't just a disagreement over stats. It was a clear choice about which story to tell using which numbers.
Okay, so if the crime numbers were maybe used more as a cover story, a pretext, rather than the real reason, what does that suggest about the actual motivation for sending in federal forces?
It strongly points towards a politically driven decision. That acute public safety crisis narrative looks like it served as a useful justification for an action that probably had wider political aims, maybe fitting into a national tough-on-crime message, rather than being a direct response to the actual current situation in Memphis, as reported locally.
And unsurprisingly, the announcement immediately split people along political lines. You saw a clear divide, especially between federal Republicans and local Democrats.
Oh, definitely. On one side, you had this unified Republican alignment. President Trump made it central to his law and order message, promising to make Memphis safe again. And critically, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee didn't just accept the help. He stood right there with the president at the signing, called it the next phase of their strategic plan. Add in Tennessee's 2 Republican U.S. senators endorsing it, and you had this really strong top-down backing.
But what about on the ground in Memphis, especially among local Democratic leaders? Sounds like things were a lot more complicated there, maybe even conflicted.
Absolutely. Much more nuanced. Take Memphis Mayor Paul Young. He adopted this stance of, well, reluctant pragmatism. He was clear. I did not ask for the National Guard, and I don't think it's the way to drive down crime. He even directly pushed back on Trump's claim that he was happy about it. But at the same time, he acknowledged reality. I have no say or authority to stop them, so he shifted towards trying to manage it, even suggesting maybe they could do non-enforcement stuff like traffic control or beautification, trying to mitigate the impact.
And then you have Shelby County Mayor Lee Harris. He took a much tougher line.
Yeah, Mayor Harris came out with direct, principled condemnation. He called the whole thing disappointing, anti-democratic, and violates American norms. He explicitly warned against an occupation of Tennessee communities and said his office was looking into legal ways to stop what he called a federal incursion.
That difference between the two mayors is really interesting, isn't it? It kind of shows the different positions they're in. Mayor Young, running the city police, probably felt he had to manage the situation, minimize disruption, while Mayor Harris, as the county executive, maybe had a bit more room to take a strong ideological stand, speak for the wider county.
Exactly. And you heard similar concerns from other local Democrats. State Senator Ramesh Akbari called it an abuse of power. And she brought up the very painful memory of the last time the Guard was deployed in Memphis back in 1968. State Representative Justin Pearson framed it as needing poverty eradication, not military occupation. And District Attorney Steve Mulroy, he called it performative, arguing that, more trained federal agents like FBI would be more useful than soldiers not trained for civilian policing.
This really pushes us to look at some fundamental ideas about how America is governed. This deployment raises big legal questions. Federalism, the line between military and civilian law enforcement. We talked about the Posse Comitatus Act and the Title 32 workaround. Can you expand on why that act is such a big deal and how solid is this Title 32 maneuver?
Right. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 is foundational. It basically makes it a crime to use the Army or Air Force to enforce domestic laws. It's designed to keep the military out of civilian policing, a core principle. Now, the Title 32 deployment is a calculated way to get around that because, again, under Title 32, the Guard is technically under state command. So the argument is we're not using federal military for law enforcement, even though federal agencies are working alongside them and the request originated federally. It's legally complex.
And the precedents the administration pointed to, they seem a bit shaky when you look closely.
They do. Take the Los Angeles precedent. A federal judge actually ruled that federalizing the Guard there, putting them under Title 10, federal command, was illegal under posse comitatus for law enforcement. So that case actually cuts against using federalized troops this way. And the Washington, D.C. replica argument. That doesn't really hold water legally for a state like Tennessee. D.C. is a federal district. The president is the direct commander of the D.C. Guard. That unique status just doesn't map onto a sovereign state.
So beyond the specific laws, this hits at the heart of federalism, the 10th Amendment. What's really at stake for the balance of power between federal, state, and local?
Well, the police power, the basic authority to keep law and order, is traditionally seen as a core power reserved for the states under the 10th Amendment. So this kind of intervention, even if the governor agrees, arguably starts to chip away at that balance. It potentially overrides the authority of local governments, especially those that are objecting. This kind of legal forum shopping going through the state governor lets the administration frame it as state-led. But it sets a potentially new and powerful precedent for using military forces domestically if you have a willing governor, effectively bypassing local mayors who might disagree. It could really shift that balance.
And it's crucial to remember this isn't the first time Memphis has dealt with federal interventions or even the National Guard, right? That history matters a lot here.
Oh, absolutely. You have Operation Legend in 2020. That was also a Trump administration task force, brought in federal agents, ATF, FBI. But the key difference, no National Guard involved back then. So 2025 bringing in the Guard is a definite step up in escalation.
And then looming over everything is 1968. That must cast a very long shadow.
The specter of 1968 is hugely significant, emotionally charged. The National Guard was called in after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated during massive civil unrest, intense racial tensions. So for Memphis, especially its majority black community, the sight of Guard troops brings back these incredibly painful memories. Memories of military occupation, of civil rights suppression, uniformed soldiers, rifles on city streets. That image is deeply embedded in the city's collective memory.
And local leaders like Senator Akbari and Mayor Young specifically mentioned 1968, didn't they? Saying things like, we don't want to invoke those same images.
Exactly. They explicitly referenced it. And the fact that the administration seemed to completely ignore that historical weight, that community trauma, it feels like a major oversight. It just digs the trust deficit deeper.
So, setting aside the legal arguments and the politics for a moment, what about the people living in Memphis? What are the sort of human costs of this? The impact on civil liberties, on community trust?
Well, groups like the ACLU put it pretty bluntly. They call these kinds of deployments unnecessary, inflammatory, and an abuse of power. Their point is that it fundamentally goes against the principle that soldiers shouldn't be policing civilians. It creates fear, potentially chills free speech and assembly rights. And they stress that all these agents, federal and Guard, still have to respect due process, Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful searches, and so on.
And that language, local leaders like Mayor Harris used, occupation, incursion, that signals a really deep unease, doesn't it? Especially given the city's demographics and that history we just talked about.
It really does. State Representative Justin Pearson put it powerfully. You can't not think what the weaponization of the military against black communities and black people has looked like before. That speaks volumes about the fear and historical trauma this triggers, and it raises real concerns that this whole thing could actually be counterproductive for safety.
How so? Counterproductive?
Well, the worry is that such a heavy-handed, militarized presence could seriously erode the fragile trust that might exist between the community and the Memphis Police Department itself, making people less likely to cooperate, less likely to report crime, which makes long-term crime reduction much harder. As Representative Jesse Chisholm warned, it could rip the scab off of a wound that is just beginning to heal. It potentially undoes progress. And it also puts the MPD in a tough spot, right? It creates a crisis of legitimacy for them. They're putting out data showing improvement, and the federal government overrides that with a crisis narrative, makes them look ineffective or untruthful.
So, zooming out, what are the bigger implications here? Beyond Memphis, what could this mean for how the U.S. governs itself, for that line between civilian and military roles?
Well, first, there's the potential for legal challenges. Governor Lee's okay makes a direct posse comitatus challenge tricky. But local governments might sue based on home rule principles or the 10th Amendment, arguing their authority is being violated. And of course, if there are specific incidents of rights violations by the task force, you could definitely see civil rights lawsuits popping up.
And there's still that lingering question. Is this really about cutting crime, or is it about something else? Politics. Optics.
Yeah, that performative aspect that D.A. Mulroy mentioned keeps coming up. Is the main goal sustainable crime reduction in Memphis? Or is it more about scoring political points on a national stage, demonstrating a tough-on-crime stance? Without clear, measurable goals for the task force, there's a risk it just becomes this open-ended presence, its duration dictated by political wins, not public safety needs. And this Memphis model, if you want to call it that, it could have real long-term effects. It could start to normalize using the National Guard for regular city policing, as long as you have a supportive governor. That would fundamentally change the traditional separation between military and civilian law enforcement.
Which risks really politicizing the National Guard, right? Using it as a tool in political disputes.
Exactly. And it also points to a worrying trend, maybe. Dismissing objective data-based analysis when it doesn't fit the preferred political story. Ultimately, this whole situation acts like a stress test for American federalism. It forces this confrontation between federal power, state authority, and local autonomy.
So today we've really dug into this multi-layered situation in Memphis. We've seen the calculated legal steps, the totally clashing stories about crime, the split political reactions, and how deep historical wounds shape how the community sees all this.
Yeah. What's really striking is how this one action puts so much to the test, the balance of federalism, that fundamental line between military and civilian duties. It touches on some core American principles.
And this Memphis model, as you called it, it could seriously redraw the power map in American government, maybe make it more common to see military forces used for domestic policing. So the question for you listening is, what could this mean for your community? How might blurring these lines between law enforcement and the military affect civil liberties across the country down the road? Definitely something worth thinking about as this story keeps developing. You've been listening to Nation Scope Podcast, where Jordan and Jamie analyze the stories shaping America and the world. Thanks for